Gary tightened the last lug nut on his old Ford pickup in his quiet Nashville driveway just as the morning sun slipped over the Tennessee hills. He'd been married to Stephanie for 7 years, worked long days in construction for North Peak Engineering, and thought he knew his wife better than anyone. Today, they were driving 200 miles east to Knoxville for his cousin's wedding, just the four of them. Gary, Stephanie, and her sisters, Jessica and Vanessa. He felt proud to provide the truck, split the gas money, and cover half the hotel costs. Stephanie kissed his cheek, soft and warm. "Ready for a fun weekend, babe?" she asked, her voice light with excitement. Gary nodded, smiling, though a curious knot of unease tugged at him. Inside the truck, Jessica teased him about how he planned every minute. "Relax, Gary. You need to learn to go with the flow," she joked, leaning forward over the console. Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Yeah, before you got all domestic and boring," she added, her tone sharp but playful. Gary laughed it off, turning the key in the ignition, but he did feel the stirrings of something unsettled. As they drove, Stephanie kept glancing in the rearview mirror, her lips pressed tight while her sisters exchanged quick whispers. When he asked if everything was all right, Stephanie flashed a reassuring smile and said, "Just sister stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." But Gary's gut told him otherwise. He remembered last month's dinner when Jessica said, "You know, Steph deserves someone adventurous, not a man who works nights and sleeps by 9. And Vanessa's scoff, "Not everything needs fixing by a man." He had laughed, brushed it aside, but as the miles slipped by, he realized those words had stung more than he'd admitted. They stopped at a roadside diner. Gary paid for sandwiches, and while he refilled the gas tank, he overheard Stephanie whispering urgently with Jessica in a corner booth. He hesitated at the door, knobs of coffee steam drifting past him, before stepping inside. "You okay?" he asked softly. Stephanie looked up, eyes bright but remote. "Fine," she said, voice clipped. "Go ahead, get your coffee." He watched her and Jessica share a glance that felt heavy with secret meaning. Vanessa glanced over and smirked before returning to her phone. Gary felt his heart tighten. He forced himself to smile, telling himself he was overthinking. He finished his coffee, climbed back into the truck, and drove off with Stephanie closing the door behind him. As they merged onto the highway, Gary settled into his seat, hands on the wheel, determined to enjoy the weekend. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something he couldn't yet name, and that this drive would change everything. They pulled into a lonely gas station just as the sun was dipping behind the ridge of the Cumberland Plateau, and Gary hopped out to grab coffee, stretching his legs after hours on the road. He pushed open the glass door of the station, the bell jingling, and took in the empty aisles before stepping up to the counter. While the clerk filled his cup, Gary scanned the room and felt eyes on him. But when he turned, there was no one, just cool fluorescent light and the low hum of the freezer. He paid his $1, poured the coffee, and headed outside, expecting to find Stephanie and her sisters waiting by the truck. Instead, the engine was running, the windows fogged with warmth, and their silhouettes flickered in the side mirror as the taillights blinked to life. "Hey!" he called, dropping his coffee in surprise and making the cup rattle on the ground. He lifted his hands toward the window as Stephanie rolled it down, her grin wide and strange. "Get in the car, Gary," she said, but there was no warmth in her voice. He stepped forward, heart pounding. "What are you doing? This isn't funny." Jessica leaned forward from the back seat, arms crossed, and said, "You're always so clingy, Gary. We thought you needed an adventure." Vanessa added under her breath, "A little independence lesson." He looked at their faces, pale in the dashboard glow, and felt cold. "Independence?" he asked, voice tight. "My truck is back in Nashville." "Exactly," Stephanie said, pulling away slowly. "Figure it out yourself." She hit the accelerator, and the truck rolled toward the highway, leaving Gary clutching his wallet and keys, house keys, not truck keys, in his hand. For several seconds he stood frozen, coffee sloshing onto his jeans, watching them disappear down the black ribbon of road that ran, their laughter echoing until it faded. He dropped to his knees, scooped up the keys and wallet, and jogged to the station door, panic rising. Inside, he found the clerk stacking soda cans. "Do you have a phone book?" he asked breathlessly. The clerk blinked. "No, but you can use the landline to call a taxi." Gary nodded and dialed. "I need a ride to the bus station in the next town," he said, forcing calm into his voice. $40. He swallowed hard, handed over crumpled bills, and watched through the window as the taxi pulled up under the yellow light. He put his things in the back seat and gave the driver the directions and what little cash he had left. The car bounced along county roads, and the driver made small talk, weather, local diners, but Gary stared out the window, mind racing. He felt sick with betrayal and humiliation. At the bus station, he stepped onto the concrete platform, the night air sharp with promise of frost. A sign said the next Greyhound to Nashville left at 10:15 p.m. He checked his phone. Only 3 missed calls from Stephanie, Jessica, and one unknown number. He dialed his mother, voice small. "Mom, something happened." She whispered concern, told him to be safe, and he tucked the phone away, tears blurring his vision. When the bus arrived, he boarded, found a window seat, and the door hissed shut behind him. As the bus rumbled into the darkness, he pulled his coat tighter and thought about every warning sign he'd ignored. The whispered jokes, the last-minute hotel reservations under her name, the teasing about being boring. He thought about the times he'd stayed silent when they made fun of his work boots or his careful nature. He remembered Jessica's voice over dinner. "You never used to be so serious." He clenched his fists on his lap. He promised himself he'd stop being the lost puppy they laughed at. He'd learn for real how to stand on his own. The road stretched before him in ribbons of headlights and taillights, and he watched the world pass. Empty fields, distant farmhouses with lights in their windows, the occasional trucker at a rest stop. He closed his eyes and let the hum of the engine fill his ears as memories and rage and a fierce new resolve churned inside him. By the time the bus crossed into Tennessee, his fingers itched to plan his next move, and his heart had hardened into something like steel. He would not beg forgiveness. He would not crawl back. Instead, he would chart a new path, one that began the moment he returned home and uncovered every secret they thought was safe in the dark. He would show them the man he really was, and they would learn, too late, the price of their cruel prank. When the Greyhound pulled into Nashville early the next morning, Gary stepped onto the platform with every muscle screaming for rest, his coat damp with condensation from the long ride. But he forced himself to stand tall and flag down a taxi to Kevin's apartment on the city's east side. Kevin answered the door before Gary could knock, eyes heavy from a night shift at the tire factory, but he immediately saw his brother's ashen face and threw an arm around him. "What happened?" Kevin asked quietly, guiding Gary inside to the couch. Gary sank into the cushions and ran a hand through his hair. "They left me," he said simply, voice thick. Kevin waited, then held out a steaming mug of coffee. "Tell me everything." Gary took the cup and began from the beginning. The jokes in the truck, the weird silences, the stop at the diner, the whispered words, and finally, the gas station prank. Kevin listened without interruption, his jaw tight. When Gary finished, Kevin slammed his fist into his palm. "That's not a joke," he said. "That's emotional abuse." Over the next day, Gary rested while Kevin made calls to find cheap lawyer referrals. But Gary's mind was already racing. He felt anger twisting into determination. That evening, he set up his laptop on Kevin's kitchen table and typed Harassment Law Tennessee into the browser. He left a tab open on legal advice forums while he scrolled through his phone's blocked numbers list, writing them down in a notebook. He copied the timestamps of every voicemail his wife and sisters had left. Messages labeled, "Figure it out yourself," "You overreacting," "We're worried about you." His fingers tightened around the pen as he realized what he needed. Documented proof. He remembered Stephanie's laptop sitting unlocked in their house, and an idea began to form. "Kevin," Gary said, looking up, "I need your help getting back in the house." Kevin's eyebrows shot up. "Are you serious?" he asked. Gary nodded. "I need to find our group chats, the texts, anything that shows they planned this." Kevin agreed without hesitation, and that night they drove to Gary's empty home. The street was dark and the house loomed silent, lights off. Kevin picked the lock with tools he kept in his car from odd jobs. The door clicked open and they slipped inside, careful not to disturb anything. Gary headed straight to the desk where Stephanie left her laptop. He opened it without a password, clicked through browser tabs, and found a chat window with Jessica and Vanessa. His heart pounded when he saw months of messages, screenshots of their texts to him, laughing emojis, plans for the trip. "Look at this," he whispered, turning the screen to Kevin. They knew exactly what they were doing. A cold calm settled over him as he scrolled deeper. A week before the wedding, Jessica wrote, "We should ditch him and see how long he lasts." And Vanessa replied, "Yes, imagine his face when he realizes." Stephanie chimed in with a gif of a puppy looking lost. Gary closed the laptop slowly. "This is everything." He copied screenshots to a USB drive and closed the laptop, leaving it exactly as they found it. Back at Kevin's apartment, they packed up the drive and planned the next step. Over cold pizza, they drafted an email to a recommended lawyer explaining the harassment and including the screenshots and voicemail transcripts. Kevin said, "We'll get you someone who can help file protective orders and get evidence ready for divorce court." Gary nodded, a sense of relief washing through him. "But I want more," he said quietly. "I want them to see the real me, strong, successful, independent." Over the next week, Gary met with the lawyer, Patricia Coleman, and walked her through every detail. He handed her the USB drive. Patricia leaned back in her chair and said, "This evidence is strong. We'll push for no contact orders and include this in the divorce filing as proof of emotional abuse and harassment." Gary exhaled, the weight lifting from his chest. In the days that followed, he focused on rebuilding his life. He enrolled in night classes at the community college for business management, a plan he'd always postponed. He used his savings to rent a small downtown studio apartment, his first ever on his own, and painted the walls light gray, buying new furniture without consulting anyone else. On the first morning in his new place, he sat at a tiny table with a cup of coffee and drafted a business plan for Thompson Contracting, his dream of owning an honest construction company. He sketched budgets and client outreach ideas, feeling a fierce excitement he hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, messages popped up on his phone, calls from blocked numbers trying to reach him, texts from unknown contacts saying, "You're overreacting," and "Come home, Steph's worried." He ignored them all, each ignored message another small victory. When the protective order was granted, he felt vindicated. No more calls, no more pranks. He hung the court document inside his apartment door like a shield. As weeks turned into months, Gary found a rhythm. Classes on weeknights, work in the day helping Kevin on his projects, and evenings drafting plans for his company. He smiled more, laughed at jokes, and slept without nightmares. And always, in the undercurrent of his peace, flowed a quiet, powerful truth. He'd turned their cruelty into the fuel for his own transformation, and the man he became was exactly the one they'd tried to erase. Early the next spring, Gary sat in the small conference room of Patricia Coleman's office, his hands folded on the polished wood table. The walls were painted a soft cream, and sunlight filtered through the blinds and slats, like bars holding him until the truth came free. Patricia looked at him with steady eyes and said, "We have everything ready for your divorce petition. We'll submit the evidence of harassment, the group chats, the social media posts, the voicemails. I'll file for joint custody of your time and for equitable division of assets." Gary nodded, relief and resolve mixing in his chest. He remembered every cruel joke, every whispered plan, as if it were yesterday. The day they left him at that gas station 200 miles away in Tennessee. He remembered the cold wind, the long bus ride, the moment he realized he had to save himself. He had done the work. He had gathered the proof. He had rebuilt his life. He had hired Kevin and Marcus in his new company, Thompson Contracting. He had filed the protective order that banned Stephanie and her sisters from contacting him. And now, he would finish what he'd started. When Patricia left to file the papers, Gary stood and paced the room, looking at the timeline of his life spread across his mind. The day he married Stephanie in a white shirt and tie, the steel echo of the church bells, the laughter at the reception, the early mornings at the lottery office that he had emptied into his bank account for their shared future, the whispered doubts he had never voiced, and the last look he had given his wife as he walked away from their empty home. He felt a strange calm as he remembered the final bombshell he had prepared. A letter to the court explaining that he had created a scholarship fund for those who suffered emotional abuse, seeded with proceeds from Thompson Contracting's first major project. No one knew it was his. He had done it under the name GT Memorial Fund. But Patricia had included press clippings showing the fund's launch, the local news headline reading, "Tennessee Contractor Funds Healing Scholarship," the article quoting anonymous testimonials from survivors. He thought of the day he handed that check to the nonprofit director, feeling the weight of every dollar, every step of their betrayal. Every night he lay awake crafting his plan. The scholarship stood as proof not only of his recovery, but of his triumph over their cruelty. When Patricia returned, she placed the filed documents on the desk and said quietly, "Your petition is filed, and the court date is set for Tuesday morning at 9. You'll need to be prepared to speak briefly about the evidence, but the judge has already issued a temporary no-contact order. They cannot approach you or your home." Gary inhaled slowly, picturing Stephanie's face when she learned that her final act of control would be turned into her undoing. He remembered her phone call from Kevin's building, tears in her voice as she begged him to come home. He had stepped back into the elevator without a word, leaving her standing in the lobby. "You can't just vanish, Gary," she had said. He had thought then, "I already have vanished. From the marriage, from her world." Now he would vanish from her mind, replaced by the legacy he built in peace. On the morning of the hearing, he arrived at the courthouse in a dark suit, his tie knotted with confidence. Patricia met him at the door and smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. Inside the courtroom, sunlight slanted across the wooden benches, and he saw Stephanie at the petitioner's table, her face pale and drawn, her sisters sitting stiffly behind her with downcast eyes. Her attorney rose to speak first, his tone slick. "Your Honor, the respondent abandoned his wife after a minor misunderstanding. He refuses marriage counseling, and he left without notice, causing emotional distress to the petitioner." He spread out maps of the highway, stamped bus tickets, and played a snippet of Stephanie's voicemail saying, "I'm worried. Isn't that enough?" The courtroom murmured softly, pity in their eyes. Then Patricia stood and approached the bench with quiet authority. "Your Honor, I submit this evidence," she said, handing over a stack of color-printed screenshots and social media posts. "These messages show a premeditated plan by the petitioner and her sisters to humiliate the respondent. Here are the group chat logs from March of last year, where they plotted to abandon him at a gas station. Here are Instagram posts from that night, showing the petitioner and her sisters celebrating their success at a downtown bar. Here are transcripts of repeated harassment after the no-contact order, including calls to his workplace and texts from blocked numbers. Furthermore, the respondent has demonstrated resilience and positive community impact by establishing a scholarship fund for survivors of emotional abuse." She placed before the judge the scholarship press release. The hush fell deeper in the room as the judge scanned the documents. After a long moment, he looked up. "I have reviewed the evidence. I find that the petitioner's claims of abandonment and distress are overshadowed by her own actions of premeditated cruelty and harassment. The respondent's petition for divorce is granted. The division of marital assets will be equal. No spousal support is awarded. The protective order remains in full effect." He rapped his gavel. In that instant, Gary felt a surge of triumph, as if every cruel laugh, every plan hatched in secret, had been turned into his proof of worth and strength. He allowed himself a small, private smile when Patricia exchanged a quick glance with him. On their way out, he passed Stephanie in the hallway. She tried to reach for his arm, mouth opening, but Patricia stepped between them. "No contact," she said softly. Stephanie's eyes filled with tears, confusion, regret, he couldn't tell which, and he watched her turn away. Outside, the bright sun warmed him. He took a deep breath and felt the final weight lift from his shoulders. He had reclaimed his life, honored his own value, and left her with nothing but the truth of her actions. As he walked to the parking lot, he already thought of the next steps: finalizing his business expansion, filing the scholarship endowment in his name, and maybe, someday, telling this story to help others find their own strength. He was free, and the empty echoes of that gas station prank could never reach him again. By the time the judge's gavel settled on the final words of the divorce decree, Gary already felt the future opening before him like a wide Tennessee sky at dawn. He left the courthouse with Patricia and walked to his truck, the weight of months of preparation now replaced by a lightness he hadn't known since the day he first met Stephanie on that job site long ago. Over the next weeks, he poured his energy fully into Thompson Contracting, bidding small jobs, hiring reliable crews, and insisting on top-quality work. His reputation grew in Nashville and beyond, his name spoken in appreciative tones by homeowners who valued his honesty and skill. Meanwhile, he quietly expanded the GT Memorial Scholarship Fund, meeting with nonprofit leaders to ensure it would support anyone rebuilding their life after emotional abuse. He never linked the fund publicly to his own name, preferring to let its impact speak for itself. Every time he read a thank you letter from a scholarship recipient, his heart swelled with a sense of justice served far beyond any courtroom victory. One afternoon, as he reviewed blueprints for a new hospital renovation, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Local contractor honored for community service. He clicked the link to see a story that recounted the scholarship launch, noting the anonymous donor's initials, GT, and praising the fund's purpose. He allowed himself a small private smile, thinking of Stephanie and her sisters, who had scoffed at his seriousness and his boring ways, now powerless to undo the legacy he'd created. That evening, back in his own small house, painted a fresh dove gray, with his favorite tools neatly hung on the garage wall, he sat at his kitchen table poring over an email from Patricia. The final judgment had been entered, and the no-contact order would remain permanent unless he chose to lift it. He took a deep breath and let his thoughts drift to the hidden bombshell he'd kept until the very end. Months earlier, when he'd first hired Patricia, he had instructed her to collect every digital trace of their cruelty, and then, once the divorce was final, forward a complete dossier to Jessica and Vanessa's employers. He'd watched carefully as both sisters received letters detailing the harassment evidence, the chat logs, and citations from the court transcripts, proving their active roles in planning and executing the prank. He'd noted the day Jessica was suspended pending an internal review at her marketing firm, and the day Vanessa lost a promotion at her tech startup because her boss discovered her pattern of sending harassing messages to a former family member. He'd felt a quiet thrill each time he learned of these professional consequences. But he hadn't stopped there. In his downtime, he had also compiled copies of their group chat conversations, complete with laughing emojis and mocking comments, and mailed them anonymously to mutual friends, extended family, and even the wedding planner who had arranged Stephanie's cousin's celebration. Within weeks, private text threads buzzed with shock as people realized the depth of their betrayal. Invitations to family gatherings dried up. Social media posts faded. Their names, once whispered among circles in eastern Tennessee, were now met with awkward silences. Gary didn't gloat. He simply observed. He let the ripples of his final act spread outward until the world knew the truth of what had happened. One Saturday morning, as he and Kevin were finishing the framing on a neighbor's deck, Kevin paused and wiped his brow. "You hear about Jessica?" he asked, voice low. Gary nodded. "I heard she resigned. She said she needed to go back to school." Kevin shook his head. "She's lucky she got out before they could make it worse." Gary sipped his water. "She made her choices." He thought of Vanessa, whose LinkedIn page now only showed part-time work and a gap of 6 months that friends assumed was travel, not shame. He thought of Stephanie, who had remarried quickly after the divorce, only to be left alone again 6 months later. He remembered Marcus telling him, her new husband said she never explained what happened, just that Gary was mean to her. Gary let the moment be quiet, letting Kevin return to work. As the sun moved across the sky, Gary felt something he rarely allowed himself: complete peace. He knew he had won far more than a court case. He had reclaimed his dignity, his future, and the respect he earned from a community that once whispered doubts about his seriousness. He had taken their cruelty and forged from it a life of service, growth, and quiet power. Late that night, after the crew left and the house fell silent, Gary sat in the living room beside a small fire he'd built in a compact wood stove. He opened his laptop and drafted an email to the scholarship board. "Here is our year-end impact report. Please plan to renew the fund again next spring." He hit send, the final act in a chain that began with betrayal and ended with hope. Then he closed the laptop and stood, stretching his arms over his head, feeling whole. He walked to the window, looking out at the street where once he'd driven a truck carrying not just construction materials, but the weight of family expectations. Now, that street looked quiet and safe. No one to judge his pace or doubt his plans. Only the night and him, moving forward on his own terms. And in that quiet Tennessee night air, he heard his own heartbeat, steady and sure, and he knew he would never go back.